Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. It's a privilege and it's a pleasure, as well as an opportunity to have this platform to speak and share our perspectives this morning. I listened to Austin, and Austin did a good job in terms of breaking down what it is called the micro. For every CWG group that succeeds, there are maybe hundreds that don't succeed. But the thing is that it's a success story that we must emulate. This economy is made up of individuals, made up of government, made up of investors, made up of manufacturers, and made up of survivors. So we're going to be talking this morning about a couple of things, if I made it right. The business environment in 2026, and I think Austin referred to the fact that in 2026 people made resolutions to go to the gym, and then after a week they didn't go to the gym. But 2026 is far gone. The reason why 2026 is far gone, and we are talking about 2026 in February, is simple. As we closed 2025, everything was going well. Then, of course, there were the bombs, Christmas Day bombs. Then there was a New Year present in Venezuela. And so we have a world that we describe as ever-changing times. If you're a marksman, you know that shooting a moving target is 16 times more difficult than a static target. But also, if you have two things moving at the same time, it's 16 to the power of 2. In other words, we have the world moving due to Trumponomics, but we also have the Nigerian and African economies moving at the same time. So if you are planning, you have to take all of those into consideration. Those who fail to plan plan to fail. So today, we're going to be talking about these variables, and I'm going to be, I think that's, okay. So, what is the business environment going to be looking like in 2026 if you're a Nigerian? Firstly, you are in an economy which is $250 billion total output of goods and services. And it's broken down into 4 components. It's broken down into consumption, which is what all of us do. It's broken down also into investment, which is what CWG, Boa Foods, Dangote, Hayes Holdings, and others do. There's government, which also everything that government does, and government is federal government, state government, local government, agencies, MDAs. And then last but not the least is what we call net exports, which tells you how much we export versus how much we import. When you add all of that together, it gives you your GDP. If you divide that GDP by the number of people you have in Nigeria, 236 million if we are correct, it gives you about $1,000 per head, $1,000 or $1,100 a head. But that could be deceptive in the sense that $1,100 per head means that all of us is divided equally. It means that Ugode and Chinwe and Elijah Aliko have the same amount in their pocket, but that's not true. The reality is that, some are born great, some achieve greatness in their lifetime, and some get greatness, are trusted with greatness. But the reality is that some are more equal than others. it means also that wherever you are, no matter who you are, you have the same income per head. But the reality is that whilst in Abuja, I'm told that the income per head is about $11,000. In Lagos, it's about $8,000. And in Maiduguri, it's about $700, based on the data you have. The reality is that there's GDP's total output, and the way it is shared, there's a differential between certain parts of the country and others, between certain industries and the others. And to put some context into what GDP means, that everything put together, the 236 million Nigerians have generated $250 billion this year. And 4 days ago, I think 5 days ago, Apple announced its Q4 earnings. Apple's Q4 earnings, that is for Q4 alone, was $199 billion. If you multiply that by 4, it gives you about $800 billion. And Apple attributed this mainly to the iPhone 17. I'm talking about innovation. Austin was talking about innovation. So the 236 million Nigerians, all of us put together, we generated $250 billion. The 150 to 200,000 employees of Apple in 1 quarter generated $200 billion. I've not added Meta or ChatGPT and all that. But I'm saying that in terms of efficient use of capital, optimum use of revenue and technology, I want you to compare the two. Remember when WhatsApp was sold to Facebook? They had 49 employees and 49 of them, and they sold it for $19 billion at that time. So the macroeconomy is made up of companies, individuals, governments, net exports. And before we start patting ourselves on the back and going to self-idolation, we should realize, one, how efficient or sub-efficient, I don't want to use inefficient, we are. Austin asked me, as I came up before then, okay, is the economy doing well? I said it's doing very well. However, there are factors that are moving upwards and there are factors that are moving downwards. So if you take the number of factors that are moving positively are more in number than the ones that are moving negatively. And so, okay, what does that mean? I said, what it means is that there's numbers and there's momentum. The momentum and the gravity of those that are moving downwards are more than, that momentum is higher than the momentum of those that are moving upwards. So I explain it further. And this we had a half-a-minute discussion. I said, whilst telcos are probably moving forward aggressively, and manufacturers are moving forward aggressively, power supply is moving negatively. But the negative momentum of power supply is more than the positive momentum of those sectors that are moving positively. Therefore, in the end, the laws of gravity will apply. And in economics, at times we say we have the unbalanced growth theory that Soludo believed that if you energize the financial service sector, if you recapitalize and you put new regulations, the financial service industry, the banking industry will pull all the others in that direction and will succeed. But at the same time as it was doing that, there was the subprime crisis which was pulling in the other direction. So the banks raised money, there was also fictitious capital, But at the same time, the sectors that were moving backwards actually moved. And therefore, net-net, we didn't see as much as we should have seen if everything was moving in the same direction. I think it's important to set some context here. Two is that I've broken down what the GDP means, but I want you to understand that there's a level of integration between our economy and the global economy. And I give you examples. In 1995, there was the, the Southeast Asian crisis in Malaysia, Singapore, and others. Nigeria was under military rule. Nigeria didn't blink. The rest of the world suffered. By 1998, Nigeria had gone into 1999, had gone into civilian democracy, and we started getting integrated. In 1995, you heard of a crisis. It didn't affect you. In 1998, 1999, there was the technology .com boom, and we heard about it, but we didn't feel it. But by 2005, when Nigeria had mobile telephony, Nigeria had integrated, had raised additional capital. What happened in 2008, we thought we were still insulated from global shocks. But when the crisis of 2008 happened, it not only shook us, it almost obliterated Nigeria because of one thing. Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns failed. Merrill Lynch had to be acquired by Bank of America. And the failure of the banking system due to the spillover of the subprime mortgage led to a complete loss of confidence in the US and the global financial markets. If not for that, there was no way that a black man would have become the president of the United States. John McCain was just coasting in until a major collapse. So the world, we had become more integrated. Our own economy went into a state of shock. The banking revolution and banking reform had to stagger. We had our stock market collapse, but luckily we had our pension reform at the same time and the technology reform. That helped us to overcome that. But then we learned our lessons from there and went on all the way to 2009 and where we are today. Where we are today is 250 years ago that you had the American independence, 1776. 250 years ago was when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. And in The Wealth of Nations, he stated categorically the 4 canons of taxation. And 250 years later, we're still talking about tax reform. And 250 years later, we're talking about the War of Independence was about no taxation without representation. And you can see that even in the National Assembly of Nigeria today, we're talking about what is the gazetted tax rules and all that. So it's interesting that 250 years, right? 2.5 centuries after, we're still talking about the same thing. So some things never change, and some principles remain the same. Okay, so what do we have? Nigeria and its peers. If I can read it right, global credit ratings, look at Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya. So South Africa excels with highest GCR score. Kenya is ease of doing business. Nigeria, ease of doing business signals policy volatility. And Ghana trails slightly in ranking. But one thing is clear. All of these economies African economies and global economies are moving and making a transition from command economies to market-driven economies, from the hidden hand to the invisible hand. The hidden hand is where you manipulate outcomes. Invisible hands are where market efficiencies. And policymakers are now saying that we intervene to bring about stability rather than intervene to create false outcomes. What does the business and consumer outlook for 2026, what is it? The overall consumer outlook is that consumer confidence is rising, suggesting optimism about the economy and potential increasing consumer activity, influenced by positive expectations about family income and financial situation. At the end of the day, it's consumers. Austin talked about consumers. Everybody talks, the consumer is king, technically speaking, right? But the consumer, if your policies are not right, consumers can be the slave. And that's why you have consumer protection. We've seen this lately when the Dangote refinery versus the various importers, tank farms and all. What happened? The consumer became king. Price war between all of this. But at the end of the day, the market is the disciplinarian. If you read the papers yesterday, they said if nothing is done, we might be seeing petrol at 1,000 naira a liter soon. So, but that's not, competition will lead to efficiency, but what is the stability? And what is the business reality, operating reality in 2026? Whether we like it or not, all the way from independence to where we are today, there's one variable that has been constant, that has driven Nigeria and African countries in particular, the controlled exchange rate. And therefore, in all your business planning, you want to understand what kind of exchange rate mechanism is Nigeria adopting. The question everybody, what is the exchange rate? 1,500, 1,200? That's a number. But that number is a product of a system. So what you should be asking yourself, what system of exchange rate mechanism is the country adopting? Once you know it, then you can easily do your own calculation and trend it over time and see that the past will determine what the future is. So, resilience or non-resilience, resilience is the ability to look for internal power. Sources of competitive advantage are internal to the individual, internal to companies. And so what does resilience mean in this context? Resilience means ability to think, ability to align your thoughts with those of the policymakers, the government, the market, and the consumers, and position yourself to be competitive. Austin has told us a lot about pathways for sustaining growth of business. But the business opportunities that we see today, some of them are tied to expected downturns in activity, which is cyclical. There are business opportunities that are tied to, which are irrelevant, where the cycle is, you are irrelevant to the cycle, or the cycle is irrelevant to you, which are called defensive stocks or defensive sectors, and those that are aligned in terms of the growth trajectory. Remember, when you look at why a country is not optimizing its resources, I said just now about power, but we also talked about logistics. Somebody said agric doesn't use power, so what is your relationship between the momentum of agric and the momentum of power? Unfortunately, whatever you produce as Greek has to be stored somewhere. And you need power in the refrigerators and freezers. If not, the onions goes bad very quickly, the tomatoes goes bad very quickly. So power can be a constraint to Greek. The device that you use, you talked about MTN and Glo and Airtel. That device, if it's going to open so many applications, and you're going to use streaming and you're going to be talking about high growth speed and all of it, you need power for those devices. If the power supply constraint is that much, and we are talking about almost 200 megawatts, 200 kilowatts per head in Nigeria compared to 5,000 kilowatts per head in South Africa, about 2,000 in Kenya. So when you look at Nigeria is a big market with 236 million people, median age of 18, 19, but the public power supply or the grid collapses, collapsed 2 or 3 times already this year. And therefore, they are unable to, they are inefficient, fundamentally inefficient because of the power constraint, right? So I want you to look at the economy in that context, the macro, that we are 236 million people. We have very limited power supply. We have limited income. We have only $1,000 in our pockets compared to $85,000 in Singapore or $13,000 in China. So what is going to make this GDP go from $250 billion to $1.3 trillion over a 10-year period? How do we grow by 8 to 10 or 15% per annum? And what sectors are going to drive that growth? Number one, not in any particular order, the business opportunities, fintech and digital, because there's nothing you can do without fintech and digital. Oil and gas, very, very important. Agribusiness, if you don't feed people, and once you grow the food, then you can also export across. Light and heavy manufacturing. Heavy manufacturing is cement and steel, while light manufacturing are fast-moving consumer goods. Renewable energy, it is now clear, just like in Pakistan, that solar energy and renewable energy is cheaper and more cost-efficient today than fossil fuel. So whilst you begin to invest on power stations and thermal power stations, gas-fired, you must remember now that technology has moved, and the global environment in which China is dumping solar panels and also dumping renewable batteries at lower cost makes it almost inefficient to continue to invest in your normal fossil fuel. Solid minerals, again, look at the solid mineral map across Nigeria, and you see the effect of resource nationalism. It is not by coincidence that Nigeria found oil in 1958 in Oloibiri, and by 1966 there was already a war about seceding from Nigeria with the oil. So it's not a coincidence, right? Therefore, there's what we call resource nationalism and the crisis that comes with it. It's not by coincidence that the gold and diamonds in Liberia and Sierra Leone led to the crisis at ECOMOG. It's also not by coincidence that ISWAP and the solid mineral crisis in certain parts of northern Nigeria is also. So there's the discovery of resources, and there's also the crisis that comes with resource nationalism and the political instability that goes with it. If you read history, Latin America, why they call them the banana republics, it's all about the resource nationalism and narcotics trade. If you go to Central Africa and look at Democratic Republic of Congo, where the above the ground risk, which is political risk, is far in excess of the below the ground potential. DRC is probably the richest country in the world, but has known no peace, and probably will know no peace for a long time to come, because the resources are there. So when you look at the resource map of Nigeria, and superimpose the poverty map into that, overlaid with the poverty map, and then look at the crisis and the hotspots, and look at the political evolution of Nigeria, you need to sit back and think of how these things happen. And then as we go into 2026, key things are what we must realize is that 2026 is going to be a year of three parts. One is January and February and early March. Very, very important. What's going to happen in January, we already know, the Winter Olympics, the AFCON, and so on. In February, we have the MPC meeting, and we have the Federal Open Market Committee, we have an OPEC meeting. So, in March, we have fasting, February 18th to March 18th, and then Easter, April 4 and 5. So everything is congested. We have a Q1 and early Q2 congestion, followed by an electoral timetable. You know, everybody's going back about the electoral amendment. So you have the Tax Act, you have the electoral amendment. All these things are being congested because, and the budget, right? The national budget. Because by April, latest end of April, all the congresses, all the conventions and others, candidates will have to be known. And if those candidates are known, the political process has started. Second part is political consolidation. And the third part of the year is campaign, campaign, campaign. But it's also happening. Like in Japan, they have an election right now. The US midterm elections have virtually started, or the race for the midterm elections is on. The polls are out. So you have political competitiveness globally, political competitiveness regionally, and they're building up for it in Nigeria. What we are saying for businesses is that economic policy becomes secondary after April, May. Final investment decisions in businesses all have to be made latest by April, May. And then we ride it on until sometime next year. So the reforms, the policy change is different from reforms. Policy change is when you change policies. Reforms is when the institutions that execute it get reformed and things start to get, things are different. So from a macroeconomic perspective, we look at policy change, we look at institutional reform, and we look at outcomes. And again, like we say, there's a difference between projections and predictions. Projections are forecast outcomes based on certain conditions and scenarios. Predictions are soothsaying and clairvoyance, like a palm reader who can tell you that the rain doctor can say it's going to rain or maybe it's not going to rain. So we are not interested in predictions, we are interested in projections. So what will the Nigerian economic environment, we've said the key variables that you're going to be looking at in 2026 are, number one, the exchange rate. Number two, the budget. Number three, the inflation normalization or disinflation. We're going to be looking at the deficit. We're going to be thinking about tax reform and also, to a large extent, gradual easing of policy rate aligned with inflation. There is this slide that tells you macroeconomic snapshot. When you look at 2005 and 2006, the growth rate in 2025 was 4%. The growth rate projected for 2026 is 4.4%. Monetary policy rate, initial part of the year, is 27%. We think it goes down somewhat to 26% and maybe to 25%, so we don't rush it too fast. Inflation rate, depending on what methodology you use, is showing about 15.15 for 2025, and it's showing about 12% or about 12 or 13% in 2026. The gross external reserves is about $47 billion now. We think that depending on where the price of oil is, it could go down marginally to $44 billion, but also there can be some accretion. So we keep it on our own average projections are about $44 billion. The exchange rate as of 2025, official is 14.29, and the parallel was in 2026 is expected to depreciate marginally to 15.30, and we'll come back to that. The end of period, we think that the exchange rate stays stable towards the end of period because elections are in February 2027. Global oil price, the oil price, today the average for 2025 is about $60 or $62 a barrel. We think it goes down in 2026 to about $58 a barrel. Oil production remains about the same, 1.48, and stock market capitalization, depending on when Dangote lists, we could go from, it's 105 trillion naira now, it could go as high as 200 trillion naira. The trade balance as a percentage of GDP is 4.27. So synopsis, Nigeria's GDP is expected to grow at 4.4%. Gradual policy rate, the first shot about 100 basis points in February, we hope. That's a projection. If inflation numbers come out on the 15th and show some improvement, then the doves will be more empowered. The exchange rate will trade between, right now it's appreciating quite rapidly and it's stable, and we see that appreciation continuing. And we've talked about gross external reserves and trade balance. Now, I've already explained what the growth is consumption driven, but it's going to be, the goal is to make it investment driven and government driven as well. We anticipate that Naira will, so we'll go to the big question about, one, the mechanism for determining the exchange rate. It's very clear. One, central bank believes in efficient market hypothesis. Two, that if inflation is well anchored, then the exchange rate will be more efficient. Also, if you allow inflows and outflows, especially foreign portfolio investment flows, and your interest rate inflation differential supports where you are, then all things being equal, the Naira should appreciate or remain stable at worst. So we go to the simple, one thing is happening, the gap between the parallel market and the official market has been widening, but that's an interim or temporary aberration. We think it stabilizes after a while, and that if the central bank notices that there are fundamental weaknesses, they will then adjust efficiently. There's no question about that. They know what they're doing. The next slide will show you why the Naira is convergent. When there's convergence between all the rates, that means the currency is not misaligned. And if it's not misaligned, it means there'll be stability. So how do you work this out? And how do you compute this? We have method, this can show you. If you take total money supply and divide it by external reserves and total exports, you get 1,334, which is a fair value. If you do the purchasing power parity, which takes the price of a basket in Nigeria divided by the price in New York, you get 1,256, which shows that it is 11% undervalued. And the official exchange rate is 1,390. You can see the difference between all of this is marginal, which means the currency is more aligned and nearer equilibrium than it will be. If any distortion happens, assuming that the price of oil falls to 55, some people say, and the price of gold goes up to $6,000, $7,000, the worst that will happen is that the currency loses a little bit of its value. You see what's happening in Britain because of the Epstein files. We're seeing the British pound now at 1.36. So, but if you look at the Nigerian currency against, the dollar has appreciated, right? The dollar actually depreciated about 11% year to date against a basket of currencies. So the naira, even if you are constant against a depreciating currency, you may be losing. But if you look at the naira to pound, the pound went as high as 2,200 or 2,100, and now it's about 1,985. So it means that the currency is stable, it's within the path, what we call the efficiency path, and that it's going to remain that way. Don't expect a massive appreciation in the currency because that will not make it competitive. The next item, impact of naira alignment on businesses. The reality is that if you look at performance and corporate earnings, 2023-24, we had massive losses, and every guidance was the companies have lost because of foreign exchange translation. So, but we've been dealing with foreign exchange for the past 60 years of the country. How come in 2023, 2024, and 2023 and 2024, everybody is talking about exchange losses? You know why? Because almost all the companies are due to their parents in foreign currency. They are due to suppliers. And it was captured in the audited financials at the official rate. When the official rate now moved close to the par rate, they had to recognize those losses. Those are one-off things. And what did the companies do? They now domesticated their international obligations. And so in 2025, if you look at the results, all the companies, or most of the companies that reported exchange rate losses in 23, 22 are now reporting gains and operational profits. Their EBITDA is all positive. And therefore, it means that if you take away that exogenous shock from the system because they domesticated their debt and the exchange rate is managed efficiently like we now see, then those shocks are removed from the equation and those companies are more likely to produce efficiently and profitably. It is not to say that once the exchange rate is sorted, then every other thing happens. That is to assume that the only problem you had was exchange rate. There still are things of power, still issues of policy, somersault, multiple taxation, and so. But a big item was the exchange rate itself, and when that is solved, then the others we can deal with. So we expect a gradual reduction in interest rates, and the cost of borrowing is pretty high compared to other markets. But now we are beginning to see that change. But the risk you run is that if you bring down interest rates too sharply, then the exchange rate begins to suffer. And the last thing you want is to reverse yourself on that. So the fiscal deficit is a major issue. Fiscal deficit arises when you spend more than you earn. And then the way you fund it, we have been doing, Nigeria's governments, both state, federal, and local, have always been on a deficit spree. But how did we fund the deficit? You could fund it by issuing paper. You could fund it by actually having a supplementary budget where you reduce your expenditure. You could also fund it by ways and means, which is another way of printing money. Or you could fund it by actually raising additional bonds. What we've seen lately, we've gone away from the ways and means catastrophe of the past, and we are now trying to manage this much more efficiently with global best standards. In any case, your rating agencies will downgrade you if your deficit is running out of hand. The World Bank and the IMF also not endorse your programs if you are doing that inefficiently. So what do we expect? We expect, even if the deficit increases, it means that the amount of government borrowing will increase to capture it. There will be no ways and means. and neither will there be printing of money. The exchange rate and the autonomy and independence of the central bank will be guaranteed in our judgment. Any attempt to undermine the central bank in its execution of its mandate of price stability and soundness of the financial system will be counterproductive. So we think that that will continue. We also believe that even if, and we've run scenarios, even if the price of oil is to drop, which we think it will drop, why do we say it will drop? Because there are maybe 5 areas of conflict that will have direct or indirect impact on the price of oil. One being Ukraine and Russia. I think some talks are going on. Some Russian general was shot about 2 days ago, and that becomes another fly in the ointment. So Gaza, policy is going to become more normal as we approach the midterm elections. We believe also that U.S. interest rates are going to be more normalized because it's clear that a new nominee for the Federal Reserve is there, but he is also he's a product of a well-trained Stanford economist, Harvard-trained lawyer, but also husband of Jane Lauder, which the family that owns Estee Lauder Group. And therefore, there's old money, oil money, and borrowed money. So we think it ticks all the boxes. So to that extent, oil price normalization, because I do not think any of these things will explode again, because we are into the midterm election season. We think that interest rates in the U.S. will not fall so sharply, maybe one more cut before the midterm elections, and will not come before May or June, which is too late to have an impact. The only thing that can happen is that the price of oil comes down so that the pump price of petrol in the U.S. can help the electoral map for. So I think that's what we look at. And so we are prepared for the fact that if oil prices come down, it means that the price of petrol in Nigeria also reduces, even though our deficit increases, but the deficit will be contained by domestic borrowing. Therefore, let us assume that the price of petrol at the end of the year is about 900 naira to a liter, or let's say about 45 to 50 cents compared to $1.20 or $1.30 across the neighboring countries. We think now the AGOA has been signed, African Growth Opportunity Act, which allows exports from Africa into the United States. So all said and told, we 5 or 6 takeaways are that growth will be higher than what it was. 2, that corporate earnings will be higher, not all, but most corporate earnings. We think that sectors that are power dependent will have some challenges, but they already have alternative power supply. We think that the interest rates will decline marginally to support the disinflation trajectory, but the central bank is not going to be carried away by excessive thinking, excessive optimism. They'll be cautiously optimistic and go by what the data tells them. We think the hegemony of the dollar and the US in the global environment has reduced, so there'll be some de-dollarization, and you've already seen it happening in China, Brazil, India. So some of these things will never come back. We believe that technology will be driving the Nigerian economy, and we've seen it already, especially in the telcos and the fintech space. we've heard now that MTN is acquiring all the stake in IHS, which is the tower business. There's also the submarine cable, which they own significant interest there. And that's why in the last 2-3 days, one of the biggest drivers of stock market activity has been the telcos. So when you see an industry integrating and also at the same time consolidating, it means there's a lot of room for additional investment. Not the least being the impact of AI and the power supply innovation. So generally speaking, the data points to the fact that the economy is going to do better. The data points to the fact that the distribution of income distribution and insecurity is a major threat. Therefore, even if the data looks positive, the people will not feel it. There's a lag between when the data looks positive and when the impact is felt. And if the impact is felt, whether it's going to be equitable and fair, because productivity without equity and fairness will lead to insecurity, and insecurity will undermine everything. So you've got to look at the total package. If the news about Nigeria is about what happened in Kwara, and not about the stocks that are doing better. So bad news moves faster than good news, especially if it's coming in a context of resource nationalism. So we need to deal with our security problem, not by just sending troops there, but ensuring that there's a Marshall Plan that deals with poverty, that the transfer of money from people, consumers, to the government, that with subsidy are reverse taxes. Once you remove or reduce subsidies, you actually increase the amount of money in the government. But how the government spends it is a critical issue. So the efficiency of government expenditure, the fairness of government expenditure, the distribution of government expenditure and income, and more than anything else, the ability to read the tea leaves as to see whether the people are feeling the effect of these policies and reforms is very, very important. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.